Good afternoon. Uh, in the previous video, we started talking about the biological foundations of learning and really focused primarily on the brain and how the brain influences our teacher's instruction, as well as how we process information, how we store memories, how our cognition is influenced during adolescence, depending upon whether it is our limbic system operating, the hot cognition influencing our students' learning. Well, in this video, we're going to focus primarily on language development. And you'll notice that, like I said, we're going to have three primary units, which are going to be the social emotional learning, cognition, and motivation. And as a precursor, it's important that we understand, one, what is our role in the classroom, being an effective teacher, but also, two, some of the biological underpinnings that impact how students process information, how students remember things, as well as some of the things that are highly influential in student success in classrooms. And that is all about language development. In the PowerPoint that I accompanied this video with, you'll notice that we have a series of objectives, and we're going to focus primarily on defining the four components of language, all right? Listing the developmental characteristics related to those four components for young children, as well as it is for adolescents, and how those areas are impacted. The four components of language focus on semantics, syntax, pragmatics, and metalinguistics. Now, when we think of semantics, we're talking about the meaning of words. You've heard it used in conversation before when someone says, "Oh, that's just semantics," you know. So you're just basically saying, "That's your interpretation of the word," or "That's my interpretation of the word." Well, we're talking about the meaning of words. How do students derive meaning from words? What role do teachers play? When we talk about syntax, that's what for us as teachers, we primarily we think of when we think about language development. We always think about the teacher in the elementary school helping students to develop the sentence structures, the subject-verb agreement, past tense, present tense of verb endings, having any number of complex sentences using declarative or interrogative statements, etc. So we think a lot of times from an educational standpoint, we think of the role that syntax plays in students' learning. We also talk about the importance of language in when we refer to pragmatics, which is basically our communication rules. Now, pragmatics play an important part for students when we talk about learning about social interaction, understanding how students communicate with one another, understanding how students will develop their relationships and the kind of conversations that they have. And we'll talk about each one of these in more specificity as it relates to different age groups. And then lastly is metalinguistics, which is our knowledge of language. Whenever you hear the word meta, like we'll use when we refer to metacognition, we're talking about it all-encompassing. So think of the meta as kind of like an umbrella that's holding everything in. So metalinguistics, we're talking about one's knowledge of language, their understanding of their own language, their understanding of the rules of language, their understanding of pragmatics, okay? So those are the four primary components of language that as teachers, parents, and schools, we build much of our understanding around student development in language around those basic four components, okay? Now, when you take a look at the components of language through early childhood, one of the questions that some of you may have, especially if you want to work with some older kids, if you're working with fourth grade, fifth grade, sixth grade, or even people that want to teach and work with kids in high school, sometimes they'll think like, "Ah, why are we why are we focused on language development? Like, what role does that play in my teaching of social studies, or if I want to focus on this?" Well, a couple of reasons, right? First and foremost is most of our instruction, most of our lessons and our homework and our assessments revolve around what? The written word, right? So there is going to be a tremendous impact on students who struggle with language at an early age in their ability to meet the teacher's objectives, to stay on level with their peers, whatever grade they are in, to accomplish or to be able to be successful on the assessments. And so much of what we do in classrooms revolves around language. And our assessments revolve around language, written words, right? Or oral proficiency, right? Or second language learners, or there's a lot. And so as a teacher, it's not so much that I need you to focus on like how do you teach language, but the understanding of the biological foundation that language plays in students' overall development, be it cognitive, social, emotional, etc. So we need to understand it for that reason, and we'll go into more detail in a moment. Secondly, is that for many of us, if not all of us, we're going to be sitting in on IEPs. And when we sit in on IEPs, we're going to have to understand that there are going to be students with certain language barriers or language issues, and or for that matter, just general learning disabilities or learning issues that need to be addressed with an IEP. One of the first things that teachers and special education teachers, counselors, administrators, anyone who's parents that are sitting in on the IEP, one of the first things that they want to do is they want to do a health history for all of their students. And what you'll observe in those meetings is you're going to see a lot of questions that revolve around the early onset of language. And primarily they focus on students' receptive language as well as their expressive language. And if they had a health history of otitis or ear infections, because obviously if you're having difficulty hearing, you're going to have difficulty processing sounds. Without that processing of sounds, then you're not going to necessarily be able to produce the motor, have the motor skills to produce those sounds, which will operate and act as a delay in students' expressive language, as well as, obviously, as well as their receptive language. Well, that impacts the students' their ability to stay on task or to follow instructions or to a whole host of things, right? And so we talk about language because it really pivotally plays an important part in the student's overall development, as well as our instructional practices when we think about students that might have some language difficulties. All right. So when we think about the components of language at an early onset, and that's why we start talking about it from when kids are in early childhood. You'll notice that from a semantic standpoint, their meanings of words, okay, you're going to find that kids are going to have a natural tendency to grow rather quickly. First and foremost is that we see across cultures, language is a very, I don't want to say unimpeded or doesn't require that we have instruction, that we are pre-programmed for language across cultures and countries and everything else. So there is something that is, again, goes back to that nature-nurture aspect in the brain and how it develops, in that we are going to find kids pre-programmed to learn language. Now the question becomes, if that's the case, what are parents doing? What are caregivers doing? What are early education, early childhood teachers, what are they doing to help to improve the language development? Okay, and what you're going to find is that a lot of times it starts with the initial parent, caregiver, people working with the child. What are they doing to help those children develop the differences in sounds, reproduce those sounds, things like modeling, reinforcing. Watch how young kids will change their attitude toward an adult or a sibling when they're talking to them, how they're talking to them, reproducing those sounds. And so you're going to see a lot of that playing an important part. And we as teachers and caregivers are instrumental in modeling their language. You'll notice that from early on, they start with this kind of those single words, and they move into 2 words and 3 word utterances as they get older. And you'll notice that they'll start off with some kind of telegraphic speech where they'll have reduced amount of words, kind of almost directing you towards. I think the book talks about it like a kind of like a telegram or a text message. Like you don't go into a lot of detail. You just get to the gist of what you want the other person to understand. Like, I want that cookie. They're just gonna say what cookie. So they're gonna use those that type of language in order to illustrate their point. But they grow out of that as they develop greater syntax. As the kids get older, they start understanding the rules surrounding it. Some of those rules will be implicit. There will be rules that kids will pick up on their own with no instruction from parents whatsoever, like the idea of understanding how to make something plural, like the adding of an S to make something. So they say dogs and cats and spiders and whatever else. And we don't talk to the kids like an S, you add an S to make it plural, you add ES if it ends in S. We don't talk about that with kids. We just kind of talk and we just converse and we play and we do all those things. And they just pick up on all of these things through just sheer modeling. But they don't understand necessarily the rules that govern appropriate speech. So that's why you'll hear kids say, look at all the deers and, look at all the sheeps and look at all, whatever the funny ones that we recognize that kids will say, and we'll say, oh, it's not fishes, it's fish, or it's deers, it's not deers, it's deer, and they'll learn those things. But at first, they just understand that you add an S to make it plural, or you add an ED to something for the past tense. So I worked today, I worked yesterday. I hopped today, I hopped today, I hopped yesterday. And they do that. And so, worked it, like if you worked it, and they'll just kind of try to add the ED. That's just them playing with language. That's the nice thing about it, is they hear, they model, and they just kind of work it through. And then we as teachers and as caregivers, we help them understand the importance. And you'll see that even early on in kindergarten and first grade, you'll see these mistakes that are common, and we want to help them, correct them early on. But we don't say to them like, what do you mean deers? There's no such thing. It's deer, not deers. And we don't humiliate kids. We don't embarrass them. We play with them. So when they say deers, you'll say, oh, you mean deer, because when there's more than one, we don't have an S for that one, but we do like for dogs or cats, but we don't use that for deer. It's just deer. 1 deer, 2 deer, 3 deer, 4. And we just talk and we model and they ask us questions, funny things. And the book gives you some good examples of where kids will commonly make mistakes in their syntax and how they're doing it and how we play along with that. And by play along, I mean, we just want to encourage language. We'll help them fix their mistakes, but we're not gonna focus on or isolate them for the mistakes that they make. They're developing, okay, and they understand very quickly some of the pragmatics behind language and its purpose and its meaning and how they get our attention and how they direct us to something And like I said, it's at very early on, pre any sort of instruction, just interaction with their grandparents or parents or caregivers or siblings. They learn the rules, and that's what we're talking about when we say metalinguistics. Their recognition of written language, how it works, all of that stuff. Watch a young child have a book. You know, it's reading time. They want to read, okay? They don't know how to read. They don't know how language is developed, how the written word, any of that stuff. But you watch a young kid, they pull out a book, and they got a book. That book could be upside down. Now, luckily, if we got pictures in there, they'll kind of realize the picture's upside down, they'll fix it, right? And they'll sit there, and they'll track, and they'll go left to right, and they'll do all that stuff. Sometimes they go the other way first. They go to this page, and they go to this page. They understand how we read. They understand what it looks like. And so kids are just sponges, just sucking all that stuff in. And as teachers or caregivers, we're going to help them. We're going to help them develop that. Now, what's really interesting is the explosion in vocabulary. So when they're learning multiple words a day. When kids are really young, they may start off in early elementary, pre-elementary, 4,000, 5,000 words. As a child, they grow that vocabulary, get to 16,000. By a teen, they're 50,000. By early adulthood, it's like 80,000. You're like, holy cow, do I really know 80,000 words? Well, yeah, you probably do, okay? And the more we read, the greater, the stronger our vocabulary, right? So we start thinking about that from an early, as an instructor, as a teacher, when kids are working, we pay attention to that. We are the early guard, so to speak, of the watchtower. And that watchtower is our kids growing and developing educationally. We watch for common mistakes. We look for errors. We look for repeated errors where they're not picking up on what they're doing wrong. If we don't pay attention as teachers to some of the fundamental problems that they have, not the typical ones, and I use examples in the PowerPoint as far as like overgeneralization or undergeneralization. Those are typical syntax, metalinguistic errors that kids make. That's just normal. When they have a dog or cat at home and they're really young and they see another animal that has 4 legs and is furry and has a tail, and they have a dog at home and they see a cat and they just call it a dog, or they see a goat and they say a dog. It's like, well, what? That's not a dog. But why would we assume that they know what a goat is? It has 4 legs, it's kind of hairy or furry and has a tail and whatever. Just looks like another dog, right? They grow into that. Those are common errors that kids make. When kids point to other adults and they're like mommy and daddy and they're wrong, they just see another male figure, those are common. When we start to see kids, or for that matter, when kids mess up on B's and D's and P's and Q's, or the sounds and the pronunciation of sounds like car, car, and then they say tar. Very similar. Very similar. So it's very understandable that kid will say, look at the tar go by. Car, common mistake, right? The writing of letters. All of these things are just normal. And as a teacher, we watch them. We encourage them. We help fix that stuff. But we're mindful of these errors because when they get further and further behind, or they start to display an error that they can't self-correct, or they can't help with instruction, they can't fix that, maybe something else is going on. When they look at letters and they're reading stuff and they're making this common mistake, they can't get past it. Well, maybe something's happening with their vision. Maybe something's happening with their hearing. Okay, maybe they have a speech impediment, a speech issue where they can't form certain lingual acts that will help them produce certain sounds. Teachers are instrumental in helping catch early onset for learning disabilities and things like that. So that's why we talk about it, is because they're so pivotal in our instruction and their writing and their reading and their expressive language. Now you throw on top of that students that come to a classroom where English is a second language, you have a whole host of issues that you have to address. Luckily, most of the languages are for a lot of students. While there might be some mechanical issues, left to right. In Arabic, I believe it's right to left. So you'll find some fundamental differences. But what we look for is their ability to understand the role that language plays and how we can help them develop that, right? So learning does follow certain language rules. As teachers, we implement those rules. We look for those kids. Are they picking up on the general syntax rules? Before they even get to school, how do they learn them? Who is their models? Are they getting a lot of reading at home? Are they exposed to language at home? Are they exposed to language in English at home versus another language? These are kind of questions that we as teachers will try to better understand and solve as the kids get older. One of the things that's really interesting to see is as they get older, and the book talks about different roles that teachers play in helping kids in early onset as far as their language. I'm thinking, if I get out of focus here for a second, caregiver techniques, and they talk about expansion, they talk about recasting, they talk about joint attention, they talk about different rules and things that we can do that will help facilitate some of the language development. One of the things that's really interesting that we see is kids are starting to get one thing that's really interesting is, I'm just going to try to make a little graph here, right? So kids that are exposed to a lot of language, books at home, reading and stuff like that, these kids come to school and they've got a lot of those sounds. They might even have sight words down, the is, the ats, the tos, the ands, the things that are going to be play a nice role in trying to pull sentences together and all that stuff, right? Kids come to school, and sometimes you're going to see kids up here and you're going to see other kids down here, right? Limited exposure to language. Other kids have a lot of exposure to language, right? Well, luckily is, and I'm not going to ever discourage children from developing language at a young age, when they're at home and parents are reading to them, because all along they're creating these schemes. Think about this. We talk about how the brain develops, right? The brain, not from a memory standpoint, from a learning standpoint, right? We talk about these synaptic connections. Language is another form of schema learning. A scheme is just a mental snapshot of something, right? You read a word and you see the word goat, all right? You don't have a picture of a goat in your head when you're really young if you've never seen one, and so the parents might show you a picture. Or you might say, oh, that's a goat, and they talk about it. Now what happens is you read the story about the goats, the three billy goats, and you talk about things like what they do and how they behave and all that stuff. And all along, you guys are creating synaptic connection. You're creating memories related to a scheme. That scheme is around goats, right? Well, think about that. As a young child, growing before you even get to preschool or to grade school or whatever it is, the more schemes you have, it's like you're coming into the classroom with all these pictures in your head, all these memories, and the teacher is just reading stuff, talking about stuff, and bing, 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 bing. You're grabbing all of that stuff and you're making new meanings and new synaptic connections, right? Now, the kids that come to school with a limited exposure to reading and to concepts and schemes and stuff like that, they come and it's all, they're just bombarded with all these different things, and they have to really catch up. Now, here's what's interesting. Kids here, kids down here. Well, what happens is, as time goes on, that learning trajectory is like this for kids that have good exposure to, they just keep on learning. They have good exposure to written language, reading, stuff like that. Now, the kids that come way down here, what's really nice is kindergarten, first grade, that trajectory is even higher. It's real high. Why? Because all of this stuff is new, and by about second grade, these kids almost always, many of them, if not most of them, catch up with their peers in their language acquisition. Because now their school day they're very similar to each other. Most of them are in there 8 hours, and they go home and they've got exposure to their parents and their siblings and language and stuff like that. But now the bulk of their day, they are on a level playing field, right? What's interesting is these kids get to around fourth grade, and we see this thing called the language and how it leads to literacy. They've got all the sounds by elementary school. They understand the phonology. They understand the tra and the bra and the fra. They got that stuff down. They understand semantics. They understand the syntax associated. They have good cues for reading, all of that. Then they get to about fourth grade and they hit this slump. Okay, why do they get to this slump? Think about it. What changes between third grade and fourth grade as it relates to reading and literacy? Are you thinking about it? Think about how the books change. Think about when you're reading the Junie B. Jones book or you're reading the different books, and now you start reading stuff and teachers actually give you books, textbooks, and those textbooks have more academic language. So suddenly you used to read for fun, now you're reading for meaning, and you're reading for academics. So you start seeing words where they talk about things like a water cycle, and then they introduce this word called evaporation. Like, what the heck's evaporation, right? Now some people might know it already, but now you're actually asked to learn and understand academic things. And so really what we see is this slump. It's like learning, reading, plateau. Fourth grade. Goes like this. And then pretty soon it's like, okay, I'm getting this thing down again. I'm getting this thing again. I got it. And that's kind of what we see. Okay? Now, as kids get older, and they enter to middle school and they get into that early adolescence, those same four components play a part: semantics, syntax, pragmatics, metalinguistics. But we see some changes, all right? Some of the changes that we see are obviously semantics, right? The meanings of words, increased vocabulary, an understanding of figurative language. Figurative, you guys know what figurative language is. It's the understanding of an expression, using an expression figuratively. So you say things like a student keeps monkeying around, and you finally say to somebody like, "Hey, I'm serious as a heart attack." It's like, what does that mean, right? When they're little, they're like, heart attack? Who's having a heart attack? When they get older, they realize, oh, that teacher's not joking around, or that parent's not joking around, right? Or if you're hanging on by a thread, right? No one's hanging on by a thread, but that means that, or you're playing that Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, and you're calling for a lifeline, right? Okay, what is a lifeline, right? We understand, figuratively speaking, what that means. It doesn't mean that somebody's actually holding our life in their hand by getting on the phone and answering a call. They are our lifeline to answering this question, which helps us possibly win $1 million, right? They understand figurative language. They use that. Syntax, they understand the more complex grammatical structures. They understand things about predicate, direct objects, and prepositional phrases, and they understand more of the diagramming of sentences, etc. Pragmatics, so they are aware of both indirect requests as well as appropriate responses. So when you think about pragmatics, picking up on communicational cues, understanding things like that, I often think of when my kids were little, I might say something to them. I might say to them like, "Hey, we got a busy day. We've got to clean our rooms, etc., etc. We got to clean the garage." And the kids are all like, "Oh, okay." And as they get older, I say things like, "Hey, we got a lot to do today. We got to get the garage clean. We got to get this clean. We got to get this." And suddenly, as they're getting adolescents, like, we? Like, what do you mean we? They get it that dad's not playing any part of this, but dad's supervisor, they're the workers, right? So they say we, you mean me. And I can laugh at it because they're right, but they understand it. They understand how that works. When we talk about metalinguistics, we're talking about the multiple definitions, evaluating sentences, types of sentences, tools, strategies for language use, etc. They understand much better than when they're younger about how language is going to play out. Now, issues for early adolescence, middle adolescence, things that will come into play a part in language but also has a pivotal part in students' social emotional learning and their formation of friendships, relationships with teachers. One of the things is, as students get older, because of their sheer exposure to lots of language and reading and stuff like that, they understand greater syllabic stresses, how they say words, the nuances of sounds. They pick up on the slight differences in sounds, and how we may be emphasizing a point, okay, in both English and other language. They understand from that standpoint. Academic language, learning the terminology associated with different disciplines. So as they get older, they start understanding words that are going to be associated with science versus those with language arts versus with music. So they start picking up on, they understand academic language apart from things that they might have in common language with their friends or with when you're reading for entertainment purposes, all right? You also notice as they get into early adolescence, their use or appropriate use of slang. Slang plays an integral part in students becoming, developing relations with their peers. How does that happen? Well, a lot of times, it's when I was growing up, and I'll even see this today, there will be words, so you use the word like, oh, that's cool. What does that mean? No one's talking about temperature. They're not saying like it's cool to the touch. They're saying that whatever you're talking about is really interesting. It's really fun. It's really entertaining, whatever, right? And so you'll see any given day in a classroom, in middle school and junior high and into high school, kids will say things. They'll talk about watching a UFC fight, and like, that guy's savage. Like, what do you mean, savage? Like, what does that mean? Well, just the way, or they're listening to that music or something like that, and they'll say, or they're talking about a function they were at, and that function was I don't know, was lit, or that they'll say things that'll show my age here as far as me trying to find appropriate slang terms. But the idea is just listen to your students at an early age, to junior high and to high school. You're going to hear them come up with different terms, and those terms will have different meanings, but they're used as a way to pull kids together, to kind of draw their attention to emotional things that they're talking about. And you'll see also other things in the way that kids text message, or how they're messaging through Instagram, or if it's Snapchat or whatever else. Now, how they use those terms and how often they use those terms will greatly impact their ability to perhaps influence, or I shouldn't say, it can impact their writing. Look for kids to start taking lazy ways of communicating. GR8, great. Or talk to you later, TTYL, or they do those kind of things. Now you start to write and you start thinking about capitalization and the role that syntax plays, and suddenly it's funny because text messaging is just a simple way of telegraphic speech. Like I need someone to pick me up. You just you just say R, the letter R, you, coming, question mark, are you coming? That's their way of saying, hey, is someone coming to pick me up? Or I need a ride home, which is like, are you coming, right? Those kind of utterances and just simple text messages or whatever it is can impact students' understanding of proper language rules in their writing and can influence. So as teachers, we've got to be very quick to point out that stuff. Capitalization, punctuation, run-on sentences, commas, things like that. Text messaging, those things can really have an impact on that. And when you think about, like I said, and I use some examples, I give you some examples in the PowerPoint of things to listen to, but the book does a nice job of talking about ways that teachers can help model or influence students. They have one little section that's good where they talk about ways, different ways in which that we, pull it up exactly there, in language acquisition, different ways that students will acquire language, but we talk about ways to encourage language development in the classroom. And they give you a really nice rundown of different strategies, like you don't want to be over onerous with the kids. You can use things at an early onset like song and rhymes and increased vocabulary. There's a lot of nice little examples of different ways that we encourage language development that I want you to make sure to pay close attention to. So anyway, that's the role that language plays because it's instrumental in our instruction, in our students' receptive language, in their expressive language, in our assessments, in their writing, in their fluency. We get into second language acquisition. All of this stuff plays a pivotal role in student academic development before we even get to social emotional learning, cognition, or motivation. So that's the role that language is important.